All kinds of interesting things are happening in the world, and I see that I've got at least a guest that is in the house, as well as one of our regular columnists and one of our regular participants, I should say. Columnists would be more in my world of newspaper reporting and all in that space. Though Lee Newton Rhodes, as a political person and a presidential candidate, may actually be a columnist for all I know. I'll have to ask them that when I bring them up and all in that kind of space. But there's all kinds of things happening in the world. One of our founders would be glad to know that one of the stories that I saw earlier today would be of interest to him, because definitely the network was founded by Nick Palveda and Kim Calhoun. And Nick Palveda oftentimes talks about Social Security and how important an issue that will be. And apparently, in one of the articles that I read earlier today, that is one of the campaign issues that Trump is making available as well. So he's actually using that as one of his platform things that he's going to be talking about, and some of the ways that he's hoping to address that as he runs to become a president once again. So that is one of the stories that I ran across, and this will be interesting to Lee as well, because one of the things that I ran across, and I know that it is a story that sometimes people think about, even when they think about Trump, is that there's another candidate that has thrown himself into the presidential race. And what is interesting about this candidate is that he's serving time in prison. That is right. The Tiger King has said that he is going to run for president despite all of that stuff that was going on with him and the animal activists that he tried to kill and all in that space. But he is definitely still going to be running for office, and it'll be interesting to see what happens in that regard. So I'm very much interested in seeing what goes on with that. He's saying that he has the right to run. I didn't think that the felons were allowed to run, but I'm gonna have to do some research and see if that is the actual case. But he was saying that he would be running his campaign from the prison cells and all along those lines, and that he felt that there were some important issues that needed to be addressed, and that he wanted to address those from that prison cell that he is serving time in, and all in that space. And another news story that I saw that might be of interest to folks is that apparently there is an entire seaweed thing, or like a large seaweed blob, that is heading toward the Florida coast. They say it's twice the size of the United States, and that is something else that I saw in the news that caught my interest and caught my attention. I know it's kind of one of those obscure news stories, but they do say that it could cause some environmental crisis and even some crisis in the infrastructure there in Florida as it heads that way. So it looks like it is definitely heading that way, and it'll be interesting to see what folks have to say about that as well. And then the other article I read that was kind of in that science fiction space, but it's also reality, is that many people know the famous physicist Stephen Hawking. Well, one of his good friends was saying that the last theory that Stephen Hawking had about the Big Bang Theory was that we're all living in one big hologram. So I thought that was interesting, and that was an interesting concept that was put out there as well. So that was something that I saw that folks might have some thoughts about, and maybe even have some ideas about in that space. And of course, I'm sure that there'll be a number of other hard-hitting news issues that we'll get to as well. And I see that we've got Steve Rao here, so I'm going to bring Steve Rao on very shortly. And of course, we've got a very special guest. So I think I'll bring the special guest up first, and then I'll bring up Steve Rao and all in that space. But just really quickly, just to let folks know, we've got Nancy Perpile here. And of course, she is very much involved in the divorce space and relationship space and all along those lines. So I'm going to actually ask her some questions. We were actually having a very interesting conversation on yesterday, and it was at the end of the show. So I'm going to bring up Lee Newton Rhodes as well, so that he can actually chime in on the conversation. But as I recall, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Lee, and everything, one of the things that we were talking about yesterday as we ended the show was the notion of why so many people are having sex when they know that the sex could lead to consequences, namely babies and other things, and all in that space. And that sometimes that maybe there doesn't need to be as much free will, well, not so much free will, but free willing kind of attitude about it, because you know the consequences, and you know the consequences could be babies, it could be diseases, it could be a number of other things. And of course, they would give me a hard time because, as I was telling you earlier, Nancy, I'm still in the single space. The other gentlemen were all in the married space and all in that line. So they were, and I'm going like, wait a minute, I might not want to give up on sex and all in that space just because I'm single and everything along those lines. But Lee, you might want to clarify what the position was and all that you were saying, and then I'd love to hear.
Good morning, welcome, Nancy.
Hey, good
I
morning.
just start off briefly. They tell the cop after drinking, you didn't intend to drive drunk. Well, you drunk and then you drove, so the cop doesn't care what your intentions are. we all know having a physical relationship can lead to certain unintended consequences. I use the word unintended in quotations because we have a thing called STDs. We have pregnancy. We have regret afterwards, in terms of he said, she said, was it consensual? So what came up yesterday was outside of a marriage, a long-term commitment, person's taking a lot of things on their shoulders by engaging in certain behaviors, which they may come to regret afterwards because it does have consequences. And just plead ignorance and say, well, I didn't intend to fill in the blank. Well, you knew there was a good chance that could happen. So that's what we were speaking about yesterday. I didn't intend to get pregnant. Well, if you don't want to get pregnant or get someone pregnant, abstinence works 100%. If you don't want to get an STD, abstinence works 100%. If you don't want to get brought up on rape charges, abstinence works 100%. Short of that, you're playing Russian roulette to a certain extent. I mean, were we wrong about that conversation? In your thoughts?
Yeah.
Are you asking me or are you asking Mark?
No, your thoughts, Nancy. And then I would love to hear.
My thoughts are that I think that's an intellectual argument. Human beings run on emotions, and emotions generate chemicals in your body like dopamine, testosterone, estrogen. And if you're really attracted to somebody, and the dopamine, which obviously I think everybody at this point knows, dopamine triggers the same area in the brain as cocaine. And, estrogen and testosterone are a chemical for sexual attraction. And I think sometimes those chemicals make you, you're drunk on love. You've heard that. And it doesn't have to be alcohol. It can be those chemicals in your body that are generating that desire to have sex. And as a humans, we were put on this earth. Well, I'm not sure why we were put on this earth, but notwithstanding that issue,
right.
We're meant to survive. We're meant to procreate. And that's what we're here for. We're meant to have children. We're meant to keep the species going. And I think there's a lot, the intellectual argument to abstinence, I totally agree with. I was a virgin when I got married. I don't know how many girls are now, but I'm a lot
older guys
than the millennials. I think the average age for sex in the United States is 12 to 14, right? But isn't that the average age now?
Yeah, I don't think the public schools are really teaching that now, or stressing that.
Well, I understand the argument on abstinence, and I think it's a good argument, but I also think that if people learn when they start to feel that sexual attraction, to step back and say, what is it? And is it worth the risk? So that's how I look at it. But I was a nurse before I became an attorney. And I know a lot about anatomy. I know a lot about what motivates us chemically as opposed to emotionally. And you can say, well, chemicals and emotion are the same. They're not. They're really not. But in any event, that's a whole different argument.
Hey, Nancy, along those same lines.
One second, Mark. I just want to follow up with Nancy for a second, Mark. So, is that what gets us in trouble sometimes? Not you or me, but some people, in terms of having extramarital affairs? Because the emotions and the chemicals get involved, as opposed to the intellectual side saying, you know what, this is not really my best interest.
You're absolutely right. The biggest problem with infidelity, frankly, is not a lack of commitment to the person that you've either partnered up to and promised a lifetime relationship or married. It's the fact that you're not communicating with the person with whom you've partnered up with or you're married. And the affair is just a diversion. It's a distraction from the boredom and the tedium of not really being able to get your thoughts across or come to a consensus. And you're looking for a way out. It's a diversion. It's really not love, if you understand. And so many relationships that start in infidelity, they get divorced, they marry, they get divorced because it's the risk. Infidelity generates, again, when you're in that risky behavior, you're excited, you're exhilarated, and that makes you feel powerful. It makes you feel sexual. It makes you feel happy that you're risking it. And once you come out of the shadows with the person with whom you're having the affair,
it wears off.
Hey, Nancy, along those same lines, because you did mention I'm going to bring in Steve Brown. We've also got Sasha Starr with us as well and everything. But one of the things that you mentioned really quickly was the fact of, and I did read some of your bio, of the critical care nurse, because you weren't just any nurse, you were a critical care nurse and everything, and then you decided to become a lawyer. I'm like, why she go from one high-end job to another high-end job is beyond me. But I did enjoy the story that you told, or at least in one of the articles that I read, where apparently you have a lead foot and you got pulled over 3 times. So I guess you were batting your eyes and doing the whole charm thing because you managed to get off all 3 times. So I'd love to hear this story, and if you'll share the story with others as well. Because when I was reading that, I'm going like, okay, I'm imagining that the same officer, how you managed to get pulled over by the same officer 3 times or maybe even 4 times is beyond me. But maybe it's one of them little fate things and all in that space. But when I read that story, I was like, Nancy's got to share this on the air.
Well, actually, I worked in the emergency room before I went to law school, and a rookie came in and they were hazing this guy, and they told him to go in, and I was in the trauma room that night. They told him to go into the trauma room and he had to fill out this form. Well, this guy did not know what he was doing, and he couldn't even stand the sight of blood. I thought he was going to faint. I told him to go out and sit in the nurse's lounge and have a cup of coffee. So I filled out the report for him. And I gave him the report, and these guys were so amazed that, he filled out this report. Make a long story short, my first year of law school, I lived in Allentown, Pennsylvania, was going to school in Philadelphia. I'm zooming down the highway, and he pulls me over, and it turns out to be that officer. And he looks at me and he says, yeah, I heard you, I was looking for you. I heard you were going to law school. I said, yeah. He said, slow down or you're never going to make it. Second year, I'm zooming up the turnpike. He stops me and he says, I can't keep letting you go. I mean, you've got to stop. I mean, you got to slow down. You're going 80 miles an hour and it's a 60-mile-an-hour zone. I said, I promise I'll slow down, but I got to get home fast because I had children. I was taking any course in law school between 9 o'clock and 2 o'clock. I put the kids on the bus and I got back at 3 o'clock to take them off the bus. In any event, third year of law school, I'm zooming down the turnpike. He stops me and he says, and I roll down the window, of course. He leans in and he says, when are you going to graduate? So anyway, yes, it happened to be him. And it just happened that way. It's a true story.
Yeah, it sounds like a true story. It sounds like an amazing story, and all in that space. I can relate to the blood story really quickly. I am not as accident prone as my brother was. My brother, well, my brother is, but he doesn't. Yeah, he still drives. And he drives like some kind of fancy cars and everything along those lines. But as a youth, he was very much of a lead foot, and he would have a couple of accidents and a couple of other things. But there was a time that I actually fell and broke my arm and everything. So we went to Duke Hospital, and they had to do the whole blood drawing and testing and make sure that how the bone was broke, reset it, and do the whole 9 yards. And I remember Malik coming to the place. I'm over there feeling half faint and everything and about ready to pass out. And he comes in along with my dad because they found out how to get in touch with them. They've gotten in touch, coming to the hospital to check on me and everything. And I look over at my younger brother and he's about ready to collapse. And my younger brother was like I said, my younger brother has been in all of these kind of incidences. So they were going like, well, why are you about to faint? You've been in like tons of accidents. And my younger brother in a crying mode, and like I said, he's probably in his 30s at that time, was going like, y'all don't understand that when that happens to me, that's my blood. That's my brother's blood. So it was a whole different kind of attitude. So he was having a empathy moment, and I definitely appreciated that from him and everything in that space. how did you get, because one of the things you mentioned too, and I definitely want to get into Steve and hear some of the things he's got on in the news, but how did you get into the divorce space? And you kind of mentioned earlier about the importance of communications, and we talked about that even offline as well. And I do know that a lot of times, whether it's in politics, and both Steve and Lee are in politics, communications can be one of the things that is not done all that well, despite some politicians that think that they are masters at communication. So one, how did you get into divorce law, and how important is communication to relationships?
Well, I got into divorce law not by choice, by happenstance. I wrote, when I was a nurse, I wrote a textbook with some colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania, Advanced Concepts in Clinical Nursing. And it was adopted by many nursing schools. What we were trying to do was do advanced concepts to get better patient outcomes in different departments. In the emergency room, ICU, med-surg, OBGYN, et cetera. So every chapter was a different way to get a better outcome. I went to the hospital administration, where the hospital that I worked at, and I gave them a whole list and some suggestions. And the administrator was very kind, but she looked at me and she said, now this is 1974. She said, at this hospital, only doctors recommend protocols. You're a nurse, and we're not going to be able to accept any of your protocols. So anyway, a few months later, I heard that there was a new hire at the hospital. She had been a nurse and she was brought in. She had gone to law school. She was a nurse attorney, and she was going to come to the hospital to do what I had offered to do, which is look at the different departments and try to get better patient outcomes. Because those were the days where we didn't have all the checks and balances that we have now. And there was a lot of malpractice, to be honest with you. So anyway, I asked her how I get them to listen to me. And she said, go to law school, because you'll have power, and come back into the administration. And then you can, do what you want to do, because at that time, that was my passion. I go to law school, as you heard. I finally graduated after tormenting my friend, the state cop. In any event, I was hired by a firm to do medical malpractice, which I thought would be the perfect way to find out, how to get better patient outcome in administration. So my first day on the job, there were 75 files on my desk. They were divorce files. I went to the senior manager, the partner, and said, I really have no interest in divorce. I was hired to do defense malpractice. Now, this is 1984. He leaned across the desk, put his finger an inch from my nose, and said, you're not going to make it here. You're a woman. Divorce work is women's work. And you're going to do what we tell you to do, or you're not going to make it. Well, I'm in the middle of 7 kids. And when you tell me I can't do something, that's when I dig in and hunker down and do it. So I started to do my divorce work. I did the malpractice cases. And a few years later, they lost the contract to represent the physicians in the malpractice venue. And I had all these divorce files. I was divorced at the time. I had to support my children. And so I started a divorce practice. And that's how I got to be a divorce attorney.
Wow.
Sometimes life gets in the way.
Yeah, life does get in the way. Steve, I know you got to go out, and you said you had some news stories you want to cover, and I definitely want to get to Josh as well. And I definitely want to hear from Nancy about the importance of communications. But I was going to turn it over to you just for a minute, Steve, as well.
Yeah, I've got to run. I've got my message today. I really didn't have the news cycle. I'm getting ready. I'm hosting the Biden administration small business team here in Morrisville this afternoon. So I've got all kinds of security protocols I got to work on. We're visiting some small businesses and doing a reception at the Hub in Research Triangle. Thank you, Nancy, for being with us. And it's amazing here in the RTP. The Hub is 1.2 million square feet of residential and commercial space, 16,000 acres for greenways. And they're connecting all of these employers to kind of like the old IBM 800 building Frontier, and it's called the Hub Experiences Center. So it's just really exciting. So looking forward to that. I'll have a recap. I'll be gone tomorrow, but probably Monday I'll be back to begin the week. So no, we're going to try to bring Alan Thomas on. No really big news other than a little bit scary about the Russian drone, or the U.S. drone being shot down by a Russian fighter jet. So we're going to be talking about that. War continues in Ukraine. Lots of negative feedback on Biden's budget from the Republicans. Into the 6.8 trillion. So we're going to go through that. And I'm trying to think if there's any other major news. In North Carolina, what's surprising, rumors rumbling that the Republicans, as they draw the new seats, might create a new congressional seat for Mark Robinson and might be recruiting someone else to run for governor against Josh Stein. I was surprised to hear that Agricultural Commissioner Steve Troxler might be considered, which Mark was a very unconventional candidate, but the idea there would be to play to the rural areas of the state. So I think they're definitely scared about Stein becoming the next governor, and they're trying to hold on to the governor's office. So I've reached out to Josh Stein to bring him on the show. I think that's all I've got for now. I don't know if there's any other major news.
Steve, Mark had mentioned a candidate running from jail. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, there was an article earlier today about the Tiger King, who is the gentleman that was very much in that whole anti-animal activist space. So he had actually run a couple of zoos and things of that nature. But yes, he has announced his candidacy. I think he announced it yesterday. So yeah, he's saying that he's running from jail, and you can actually look it up. The Tiger King is going to be running for office and all in that space. So Nancy, you're shaking your head as a lawyer. So what do you think about a felon running for a federal office in the office of president, particularly somebody like the Tiger King? And I do know a little bit about that Tiger King story.
What do I think about it? I think it's insane, but I think a lot of our political players today are, dubious at best. Not much is what I think. Legally, I don't know, frankly, enough about what he has to do in order to qualify. I think if he's a felon, I don't think you can vote. So I'm not sure. Honestly, I have no clue how he could possibly do it. But
the bar is very low.
Yeah, so I was trying to figure out how he could do it, because I knew that they couldn't vote, even though they have changed some of those rules. I think that as they're getting out of prison, they have allowed some of them to start voting, depending on what the crime was and things along those lines. Because I do know that there
Mark,
have been some
we have an
efforts.
attorney here also. I have a question about that. Once someone has served their term, why do they lose some of their rights? I don't understand the logic.
well, when you said he's incarcerated, perhaps.
Yes.
And that I understand. I'm saying once
While
someone
he's
served out their term
incarcerated,
and they're
I do
released.
not believe he can vote. Okay, that's what I was
I
saying.
get that. No,
So
I understand that.
after he is out, yes, you can regain the right to vote. If
Some
you're a
states that's
felon.
not true, I believe.
Pardon?
I believe some states it's not true once you're a felon.
Well, I mean, it's state to state. I mean, we've got
Right.
50 states and a couple of territories that have different rules, but I believe that if you are incarcerated, you cannot vote. So if you're incarcerated, how can you run for president if you can't vote? I don't know.
Well, I want to bring up Sasha Starr, because I know Sasha Starr has been theorizing for a while that might be what happens to Trump, because Trump has been talking about the whole presidential indictments and things of that nature. And I know Sasha's been following that case, and he's even been, before this case of the Tiger King coming up, he's been theorizing that Mr. Trump might be campaigning from the jail cells as well. So what do you think, Sasha? There might be precedent now, because
Give
apparently
us an update on Ukraine too. I
he's
got to
running.
run. I'll see you guys on Monday. Thank you.
Nice to see you, Steve.
Bye,
Good
Steve.
luck with today.
What I think is that there are several indictments in works for Mr. Trump. And once first indictment will be announced, all others will follow, and very quickly, because this is definitely a precedent for former president to be charged. It's never happened in the United States. So the first one is a critical one. If there will be a first, there will be second, third, fourth, and almost within not even months, but weeks, maybe even days. But we'll see which one, if and where, would happen. Now, that would be already interesting precedent that the former president is charged. He's under indictments, and at the same time, he's a front runner for Republican Party. So therefore, my thoughts are the Republican Party is not really doing its work to become a normal political parties with ideas, with ways to make life of people better. No, they're there just to hurt Democrats. It's their goal number one. They don't have any agenda. They don't have any policies. They have quasi-criminal in charge of their party. And I don't understand how the American people will go for it in the election time.
Yeah, that's I know that was your attitude and everything, and I know a lot of other people that share that as well. I was going to bring up another issue that I found when I was looking at different things to talk about and everything. And I'd love to hear Nancy's thought about it, but also yours, Lee, and yours, Sasha. But one of the things that we've talked about on the show before, Nancy, and you're not aware about this. They sometimes tease me because sometimes the topic of a race or rice comes up and everything. That's what Chris Greco used to call it and everything. But there was a gentleman that I was reading about recently that is doing some serious real estate development here in Durham, North Carolina, where I am based at. I want to say he's an immigrant from another country and all in that space. And he's teamed up with another immigrant, and they have formed a real estate company. And that is actually one of the areas that apparently the African-American population is not being well represented at, because I found out that there's like some ridiculously low percentage, like maybe 1% of the major real estate developers that are African American, and this gentleman is one of a select few, even though people talk about generational wealth and other things in that space. So one of the things that we've had conversation about is whether institutional racism or racism still exists, and whether there needs to be fields that need to have a level playing field. It seems to me that if you're 15% of the population, and in the case of the Latin population, maybe even you add them together, maybe 35 or 40, maybe you add all of them together, it might be even the majority of the population. And you've only got, because I think they said the Latin population real estate developers is also frightfully low as well, that would be a case of institutional disparity. But that's just my opinion when I saw that those figures were that low and everything. But I just wonder,
Mark, that's a slippery slope to say because there's disparities, it means discrimination. Very slippery, because as people, we make personal choices, lifestyle choices, educational choices, what have you, and to infer that just because there's differences, that there's discrimination, I don't know that that's accurate and it's fair.
well, all I'm saying is that there are opportunities there to buy real estate. The story that I was reading about was actually a guy that was actually kind of an inspirational story, because apparently he got fired after working several years as a teenager and was very defiant as a teenager when he was fired and all in that space. And he went to his friend who also owned a local pizzeria and everything and made a 10-year plan. And it sounds like he actually implemented that 10-year plan, because now he is actually going and created his own real estate company and has bought some real estate around the area, including some real estate that is, I won't say questionable, but it is difficult to develop because it's not in a traditional wide swath of land. It is kind of a confined swath of land, but he has definitely put together a plan and is planning to make it into a mixed development, youth, and all in that space. And I'm hoping to get him on the air on one of our shows to talk about what he's got planned and some of his thoughts about the real estate space. But I'm just wondering, whether it's that, whether it's coding, and we do know that there are efforts to get more minorities into coding, that sometimes you have to have access or knowledge, to come back to your point, Lee. And there might be some folks that even have property and have other things that don't have that knowledge and that thought about turning that into a business or into a development. This guy actually followed a mentor of his, and I think the mentor was up in New York, if I remember correctly, but it's somebody that he's followed and was just noticing that lack of representation in that field. So if there is a lack of representation in any field, then I would think that that would be a problem or a lower amount of representation. But Nancy, you probably have been one of the few high-powered women divorce attorneys, so you might have some thoughts about lack of representation as well. But I'll just hear your thoughts also.
Well, as you heard, I mean, I certainly have not been discriminated to the extent that, the African American population has been discriminated. But I will tell you that I have felt dismissed, disregarded, rejected, laughed at. And I think that there is systemic discrimination. And it's not just against the African Americans, it's against Latinos, Asian Americans. In this country, we are so divided that
I'm sorry, Nancy, I apologize for cutting you off. Can you define what systemic racism or discrimination is versus personal racism and discrimination is? Because people make bad choices. People hate other people, put other people down, criticize, and discriminate towards. We all do, even during the dating process. We're deciding who we date, who we don't date. That's discriminating on a personal level versus institutional racism, which historically was something like Jim Crow. That was institutional racism. Mm-hmm. So can you please define what you mean by today's institutional racism?
I think that's a really good point. And I thank you for that question. When you were explaining, the institutional, the Jim Crow, I believe that we have, and maybe I said institutional, I should have said cultural. I think there is a cultural discrimination. I think you're absolutely right. Jim Crow was institutional. And I think that we in this country have cultural discrimination. And Mark and I were discussing the hierarchy. Men in this country are not born genetically, or in Canada or wherever this is playing. You don't come into this world, thinking that your hierarchical status is greater than anyone else. That's a cultural thing. You're taught as a male that you shouldn't be subordinate. You need to be tough. You don't want to be pushed around. You don't want anybody to tell you what to do unless it's your idea. And women culturally are taught to be more subordinate. You get love through connection. You don't get love through control. Men are generally, in my experience, having been a divorce lawyer for over 34 years, one of 7 children, having been married to 3 different men. Currently, I did it correct. The third one was a charm. But notwithstanding that, culturally, we are taught to discriminate. We are. And you're right about the dating example. You are discriminating. You're trying to decide if this person meets what your expectations will be to go forward. But you may not be going into that decision colored with the same type of belief that you have about that person until you get to know them. Cultural discrimination is you're going into a relationship with somebody with a preconceived idea of what they're going to be like, or what their background is, or what their value is. And that's how I define it. I think that I don't think there's any question of a doubt that African Americans in this country are discriminated against by their color. I mean, I just don't believe that. I live in Florida, and I see it all the time. If you're a white woman who's driving a Porsche, you get treated differently by the cops when you get stopped for having a lead foot. I still have a lead foot. Than if you're a young Black kid in a Camaro. Completely different approach.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One of the things I was curious about, and it's one of the things we've also talked about on the shows before, both this one and others, is, and it comes to what Lee was asking, I do think that there are times that there are unwritten rules, and that whether that's around housing, whether that's around banking and things along those lines. I don't think necessarily that the bankers or the real estate agents are always doing it intentionally, but they might have like unwritten rules based on kind of the covenants of those neighborhoods and kind of the ways that the neighborhoods planned to be established and things of that nature. So I do think that there are times that African Americans, and there have been noted cases where an African American might go try to rent a particular facility and is basically told that the place has already been sold, even though it hasn't been sold whatsoever. And then they'll turn around and send one of their friends who is of a different race, usually European, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, the house is available," and try to walk them into selling the house and all in that space. And
Mark, in fairness, though, that's not only happening by white people on, as the power people and Blacks versus the ones renting or not power, the victims. It's also happening the opposite way also, where Blacks are in power and either other Blacks or non-Blacks are the ones who are the victims.
No, I mean, that's one of the conversations.
We just had this famous case, in Memphis. These 5 Black officers, unfortunately, did not treat this other Black person civilly.
And that's one of the other arguments that goes on, because even in the African American community, there is a conversation around the middle class and the Black middle class, and whether it's doing enough to reach back to the other communities. I told y'all before about some of the efforts that were being done here in Durham, where some of them were actually taking on a very strong role in addressing some of the Black on Black crime and some of the gang crime, and actually Leonardo Williams, who we've had on this show, and he's been on other shows as well, did a whole initiative around trying to encourage business owners. And that was during the pandemic because he and his wife, who is from Zimbabwe, opened up a restaurant. And when COVID happened, they saw a number of businesses that were failing. So they actually created almost like an emergency fund, not just for their business, for other businesses. And they didn't care what color those businesses were. They were just trying to keep the restaurants of Durham afloat. And they definitely did that and did a good job of it. We probably had less of a failure rate. I'm not saying there weren't failures, because there were failures during the pandemic, even here, but it was probably less of a failure rate because he put together that initiative, and that initiative actually rescued a number of folks in that space. And I know there were other ones that were done in other cities and other states as well, but it was a personal individual versus a government individual. Ironically, he's now in the city council, but at the time he was doing it, he was a private individual.
To Lee's point about the 5 officers, and Mark and I were discussing the issue of hierarchy, and I mentioned it again. Those officers felt that they were in a hierarchy higher than the kid who they were beating, and they were expressing their dominance, don't you think?
Yeah, I totally agree with that, but it wasn't a racial issue.
No.
It's a power play.
It's a male issue. It's a male issue to a certain extent.
Yeah,
Cultural, what have you, 100%.
Yeah, and along those same lines, Nancy, we were talking earlier about communications, and that's what I want to get back to, how important, because that's one of the things that whenever I hear folks, and we were talking about this off the air as well, talking about divorce, it's like a lot of people already go into marriage with the idea that they're going to head to divorce court almost as soon as they get married and all in that space. And I know, and we were talking earlier, we were talking about how communications is very vital, and I've had some other shows where they have brought up that communication issue as well. So I know that we all say that we have to do a better job of communication and a better job of trust. So it is a well-known concept, but I don't know that we understand it, and I definitely don't think that we teach it. So I just wanted your thoughts around communications and its importance just in life in general.
Well, when you have a divorce client first come into your office, you ask, background information. And you want to get a sense of what the issues are in the marriage, because those issues are going to pop up during the divorce process. And I can tell you that 98% of the time, it's not infidelity, it's not sex, it's not finances. It's the fact that these people were misaligned from the very beginning, and the issue is their ability to communicate with each other. And I wrote a novel around which All Things Bend, which came out in August, and it talks about the importance of communication and the consequences of not being able to communicate and settling for somebody instead of breaking off the engagement and what those consequences are. Now, I'm writing a second book. It's a nonfiction book. It's called The Malnourished Marriage: 5 Essential Emotional Nutrients for a Healthy Relationship. I've been doing a tremendous amount of research to discuss the chapter on communication. In that book, I use the food metaphor to explain the things, the emotional nutrients you need in a marriage or a lifetime relationship. Communication is like water. Water either crashes or flows. Words either crash or they flow. And I've been trying to figure out how to explain why men and women in particular are on different levels of communication. And it turns out that it's really a hierarchical order. Men do not like women to say, I would really like you to do X, because they don't come, as I said, you don't come into the world thinking that you're above somebody, but you're conditioned as a male to think that you need to control your environment. You need not to give in. You need to be the one who's giving the orders, not taking the orders. And if you're in a subordinate relationship like the Army, or you're an employee, etc., you compensate for that in some way. But in a personal one-to-one relationship with a female who you've been culturally indoctrinated to believe should be subordinate to you, even if you believe in women's equality, you believe that women should have the right to have credit cards, which, by the way, in 1974, I couldn't get a credit card. I couldn't rent an apartment without a male signature. I couldn't get a loan without a male signing for me. I couldn't buy a car unless my brother or my father came in and signed for me. So, I mean, we've all come a long way. So women's equality is very different than relationship equality. And
There's-
the communication style is that when men and women use different words, they live in different worlds. And in my book, what I'm giving couples is a different language. Instead of saying, we don't talk anymore, you can say, I feel like our relationship is dehydrated. I feel like we need some communication, etc. So when you start to use different words, when different words mean different things to different people, you're in different worlds. And so I think if you understand that when you're communicating with somebody, what is their cultural background? How did they learn to communicate with people? How do they resolve problems? What is their idea of communication? Are they going to be open to the fact that, you may not agree and you're really negotiating to get a resolution to a problem? So, I mean, communication is absolutely essential. If you have good communication in a relationship, you're going to have good sex, you're going to resolve your financial problems, you're going to resolve your trust issues, you're going to be compassionate and patient. But if you don't have communication, you get resentful, you get angry, sometimes you get rageful, and you act out. And that's not the recipe for a good relationship.
Yeah, I'm gonna toss it to Sasha really quickly. One of the things I was gonna just mention to Sasha is one of the things that I admire about Sasha and his wife is that they share a common interest. They're both chess champions, and that is one of their things that I think keeps the relationship going because they play chess together. And actually, I want to say that from what he's told me, she actually beats him probably quite often because she's actually the better chess player in some respects. If I'm wrong, correct me, but I think that you've told me that a couple of times.
Well, she's international master of chess, 8 times Canadian chess champion, so I don't have any regrets when I'm losing to her. That's okay. But what's interesting is that she participated in the World Chess Olympiad and got bronze medal in the first board. And when she came back to Canada, she was asked by Canadian Chess Magazine to write an article. Remember, at that time, she would beat 99.9999% of men in Canada. But the name of the article what she was asked to write was Why Men Are Better Chess Players Than Women. And we started to dig into it. I was helping her to research material for the article, and we found one very interesting study by Johns Hopkins University, which analyzed development of brain hemispheres in men and women. And what they discovered is that the part of hemisphere, the half of hemisphere, that is responsible for mathematical chess development or so on, is better developed or better created maybe in men's brain than in women's brain. However, there are some other areas which other part of the brain, the half of the brain, responsible, and that includes, by the way, communications is better developed in women than in men. So speaking about communications and from everything what you so eloquently said before, of course, women almost have to be responsible for communications within a family and sort of play around with their men to figure out what's best to work it out. However, I wanted to ask you this question. How this relationship issue is working in homosexual marriages? And have you ever had divorce cases of homosexual couples?
Yes, I have. I've represented many gay and lesbian couples because, as I said, as a nurse, you don't judge the people that are your patients. If somebody comes into the emergency room and they were drunk and, they hit a family and killed a family of 3, you had to take care of them. And I'm not a judgmental person. I think as a result of my training and my background. And so I believe I was far more accepting than some other lawyers. So yes, I did have that experience. I think that homosexual couples have the same issues as heterosexual couples. I think they may have different communication styles. I also think that there's a hierarchical order between the couple. Who is the dominant one? Who's the subordinate one? There's always going to be a dominant and a subordinate. But you can't have dominance and subordinates in communication, in a relationship communication. You've got to have parity. You've got to have an understanding that what this person is saying, if you don't agree with it, you don't just block it. You've got to have more of an open mind and more of a, stand back, take a breath. If you don't agree, understand. Communication is a negotiation for connection. That's what communication is. You're trying to connect with somebody. And homosexual and heterosexual couples use the same, in my research, use the same criteria. Who perceives themselves to be subordinate? Who perceives themselves to be of a more hierarchical stage? You've got to dissipate that, and you've got to use similar words that mean similar things to you. Or as I already said, you're in different worlds.
Hey, Nancy, along those same lines, how important or how much has it been an issue? Because we know that, well, two things. One, with COVID, a lot of people were staying together that were not used to staying together. We were talking about of that earlier. And I know that there are some people that, would escape to work or escape to the boys or girls night out. And during the pandemic, they were not able to do that. So sometimes they had to put up with those differences. I earlier made the reference of sometimes being a little bit of an Oscar. And if I was living with a partner, that would be an issue if they were doing the whole Oscar Felix relationship and we were in the same house. Like if there was the non-pandemic, they could escape or I could escape to our own individual places. But I was just wondering, how much has that played a part, and also how much has social media, because that also became very prominent during the pandemic, played a role? Because I know one of the things that I get frustrated by is I probably eat out way too much. And if I go to a restaurant and everything and I see a entire family and they're all on their phone devices, I'm going like, well, why are y'all having family dinner if you're all having communications with everybody else underneath the sun, other than those that are the ones that you're with, and all in that space? But I just wondering your thoughts on both of those.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, and that is, we don't have the statistics. They've not all been collected by the Census Bureau, but the reality is that there's been a drastic uptick in divorces as a result of the pandemic. And it's, you said they put up with it. The courts were closed. They couldn't file for divorce. And as you said, there was no place else to go. They had to stay in the same house. But as soon as the courts opened up, there was a drastic increase in the filing of divorce in Canada, in the United States, in England, in Europe. And the things that, it wasn't just being together. And you mentioned, and that was a brilliant question too, about social media. Well, the issue necessarily wasn't, there were arguments about whether they should get vaccinated. There are two very different ideas about vaccination. Whether the children should get vaccinated, two very different ideas about vaccinations. Whether they should, how they should spend the money on that COVID relief package. People were getting divorced over that. So there were so many other issues that COVID and the lack of distraction in a relationship caused, that has caused a drastic uptick in divorces. Prior to COVID, the divorce rate was between, it depends upon, what statistic you look at, 47, 48%. But we say it's about 50%. Second marriages, it's 60%. And third marriages, it's 70%. So when you talk about getting a divorce is really just a diversion unless you figure out what the underlying issue in your relationship was. And as I said, the biggest problem is being mismatched from the very beginning. And, Lee talked about, abstinence and attraction. And, sometimes you really do have to step back and take a breath and say, is this really the person that I really want to be partnered up with for the rest of my life? Are we going to be compatible enough? Or do we have unrealistic expectations with each other? And the answer probably is yes, you probably have unrealistic expectations.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Get ready to ask Sasha another question really quick as we get ready to wind down and everything. But before I get to that, I jokingly have said on this show, but not overly jokingly, hit the big 6-1 in July and everything. And I appreciate the compliment that you gave me earlier when we were on beforehand and everything. But is it too late for a 61-year-old single man, or is there still hope for me in that relationship space and everything? So, Sasha's got his wife, a very lovely wife from what I've seen. I haven't met Lise, but I understand she's a wonderful person as well. But I want to know if there's hope.
She can tolerate me, right?
Actually, what's interesting is that everybody on the show, not only two of you, but most people on the shows, I'm talking about 10, maybe even more people, never seen my wife at all. She never participated in the show.
That's not her on the wall behind you, Sasha?
No, it's my daughter.
That portrait? Okay.
It's my daughter. And everybody.
Gorgeous picture.
He said it was his daughter.
And everybody believes what a wonderful person she is, and everybody admires her and so on. Well, you can see her pictures though in Wikipedia, or you can Google her or so on, Navastar. But in person, like on this show at least, nobody ever seen her. Even Shaquille, when he was here in Toronto just a couple of weeks ago, he hasn't met her, unfortunately. She talked to him, but he never met her because, unfortunately, she had hip replacement surgery in January, at the end of January. So she still was not mobile enough to go out and meet him. Anyway.
So
can I ask Nancy a marriage question or relationship question, please?
Yes, before.
In terms of marriage, I used to think, and I was told marriages are 50-50, give and take, what have you. And the older I became, I'm learning that's not true, and it's not the right attitude for marriage. Each partner ideally should own the marriage. It's on them. They're responsible for the success of the marriage, assuming they're not in a toxic relationship and being abused. Mm-hmm. That it's on them. They should be the right partner, and as opposed to having expectations from the other person.
Absolutely.
It's 100% on themselves.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the issue. The issue is, John Gottman, who is the father of the relationship research at the University of Washington, talks about positive sentiment override, meaning that if you look at the person that you've partnered up with and they're annoying you, you have to pick out a good quality, the quality that really attracted you to him or her. And that's called positive sentiment override. And that's what you really need to do every single day. Every single day, we're going to get annoyed. We're going to get annoyed. We're going to, say, this was a mistake. We should get divorced. Everybody goes through ebbs and valleys. I'm sure even Sasha and his beautiful wife, whose name I still did not catch.
Sasha's in La La Land.
Nava, Nava.
Well, I'm sure you've had ups and downs in your relationship. Everyone has. Everyone pushes pause once in a while in the relationship, if it's an intimate relationship. But you've got to be the one to put your finger on start again. And you're absolutely right, Lee. I mean, it's 100%. And you've got to get up in the morning and say, I want to make this work. And some days you may not want to make it work.
Nancy, and ego plays into that, I guess, a lot.
And Nancy,
ego, and as I said, it's that hierarchy again. Mm-hmm. I personally, I like men. I don't think men are evil. I don't think they're the problem. I think society has not done men a good service. And I think society has not done women a good service, at least in this country. Yeah. I think it's more polarizing than bringing people together.
I'm sorry, when you say society, do you mean the church? Do you mean schools?
No,
what do you mean?
Just culturally. I mean, like.
Where did we get our culture from? Historically, it was one of those two, was it not? Churches or schools?
Historically, yes. the Puritans historically, yes, that's where it all started. Yes.
Yeah, it kind of comes back to what I was talking about earlier with you, Nancy, because I do think that sometimes there are mixed messages that are put out there for
Yes.
the way that we teach men and the way that we teach women and everything. The other thing I was curious about, we're definitely winding down toward the end, is how much of divorces between the man and the woman, usually between the husband and the wife, or even the partners, whatever that partnership is. If you want to go back to Sasha's example of the gay and the LGBT couples and all in that space, but you can't really, unfortunately, well, I guess children have been known to do it. I don't know if you've had any of those cases, but the argument that some people will say is that, yes, you can divorce your wife. Yes, you can divorce your husband, no matter what the relationship is. It's a little harder, and I'm glad that I love my family, so I would never want to divorce them in the first place, but it's a little harder to divorce your family, and sometimes folks would say it's harder to divorce your friends and everything. So I was wondering if you've ever had cases of those kind of situations, as well as a divorce and relationship expert, where folks have tried to divorce outside of the man and woman, husband and wife kind of situation.
Well, it's called a child can seek to be emancipated from their parents if they feel as if they're in a toxic relationship. The only case that I had in that regard, although I had colleagues who did have similar cases, was a child who had an eating disorder and had been in and out of eating disorder rehabs. And she just, every time she was returned home, she went right back to her bulimia. And she felt the only way she could get better was to be emancipated from her parents. And so, we were successful in that regard. But it's tragic because she really hated her parents. And, who knows where that starts? I mean, you're not born bulimic. So, and Lee makes a good point. I'm going to have to think about how to express this differently.
Okay.
I just think we're taught in schools, and I'm not sure. I think it was Sasha was talking about the study at Johns Hopkins, where men have, and I know the anatomy of that. Women have larger Broca centers. Men have, well, I can't remember, singular
Parts of the brain.
part of the brain. But in any event, do you remember when the president of Harvard got up in his speech and said that women have less math skills than men? Do you remember that? And they fired him?
No.
Well, I can't remember the president, but yes, anatomically that might be true, but you can teach a girl, a woman, a child, a young girl to have just as good math skills. The problem is there's a prejudice. Again, we talk about, and this, I've had so much fun on this program, I can't even tell you. You're talking about, discrimination. As children, I was not taught that I had great math skills. I was expected not to. The boys were expected to have good math skills. The girls were not. And there was just a communication. There's a message there that you don't have to try as hard to learn physics. You don't have to try as hard to learn algebra or geometry or whatever. The boys do, but the girls, not so much.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean,
I'm not sure if that's so much historically, maybe. I'm not sure that's today. My youngest daughter is in architectural school and she loves it. And she's doing really, really well. And it's a ton of math.
Yeah.
Well, you can learn that though. My granddaughter's graduating from high school and she's going to Auburn in industrial engineering.
My
Amazing.
Into majoring chemistry. That's
And
interesting.
I find it somewhat ironic that Sasha's wife is asked to write an article about why men are better at chess than women when she beats all the men.
Well, the truth is that actually on Saturday we have a chess show, and we had very interesting discussion last Saturday about that in top 100 players in the world today, there's only one woman, 99 men, one woman. And she's around number 76, maybe 78 or something like that. Same thing was 10 years ago. And 20 years ago, 100 years ago, there was one phenomenon, the Grandmaster Vera Menchik. She, unfortunately, she died in London during the Hitler's era attacks. And she was defeating a lot of top Grandmasters. So there was even a so-called club Vera Menchik, which included all male Grandmasters that she would defeat. But it was, again, 100 years ago. Yeah, so slightly less, around like 30s of last century. So again, but this is a phenomenon. As a rule, what we see constantly is that there is one woman in the top 100. And how they calculate? They have special ELO system in chess, which calculates all the games that person ever played and against whom he played, what was his rating, and calculates all the time electronically, of course, rating of all top players. So it in truth is, and so some people on the show believed, Jim Eder, for example, from Eder Foundation, he believed that the more women will be encouraged to play chess, the better they will become, or so on. And I was more skeptical on that if they biologically, just about chess, they are, I hate to say, inferior to men. It's coming from my mouth, and I'm quite upset about that. But you cannot fight biology sciences. You cannot do that. And where I ended the program is that I remember I read an interview with one top woman chess players, and the phenomena is that actually before the age of 12, the girls are doing in chess just as well as boys. There is no inferiority at all. But from 12 on, the boys continue progression, and girls losing their interest or so on. And she's a woman grandmaster. She said that this is another evidence why women are smarter than men. What do you mean by that? She said, well, look, if you are spending 10,000 hours to master one opening or one line, and you learn that, and now you can beat somebody in that line, but then somebody else will beat you in different line or so on. So you spend so many hours to master a thing that, unlike if you would put this hours into law or music or just anywhere else,
Something more productive.
your results would be indeed more productive and more obvious. So this is another evidence why girls are smarter than boys.
It might be a good example of that. Hey, Nancy, I want to have some closing remarks from you. The thing I was going to get to Sasha, we never got to, but I know he'll be talking about it both on tomorrow's show as well as on his show around Ukraine, Russia, and China. Is can we divorce Mr. Putin? Since you're a divorce attorney, can we go ahead and divorce him?
I'd like to do more than that to Mr. Putin, but I'm just going to keep my opinion to myself. He's obviously a war criminal.
And Mark, on the topic, I know it's late, but maybe for another show we should speak about the biggest discrepancy between men and women is what's in our criminal justice system. How men get involved in that much more so than women.
Well, I think the answer again is men are taught that they're in control. They're more aggressive. They're more aggressive to get their way. They are not going to be pushed around. Somebody, gives you the arm at the bar, what happens? Somebody gives a woman an arm at the bar, she goes to the ladies' room, right? Somebody gives a man an arm at the bar, he gets a sock in the jaw. So.
And part of it, I wonder about the role of acceptance as well. And we definitely have to wind down, but I do think that sometimes there's this whole notion, particularly in certain cultures, of needing to be accepted. The family, which I know Lee has mentioned a lot of times, has been broken down. So folks are trying to find a replacement family unit. So I think that's why a lot of people are getting involved in the drug and the gang culture, because they're trying to find a replacement family unit.
I 100% agree with that, Lee. 100%.
It's very sad.
It's very much sad, and all along those lines. Nancy, you've been a great guest. I hope that you'll come back. I was glad that
Thank you so much for coming.
You on that podcast.
I would love to. I had so much fun with you guys. It was really fun. And food for thought. Food for thought.
Yeah.
I'll see you on the highways. Zooming by.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. This is great
appreciate
fun.
you.
Bye bye.
Nice to meet you, Sasha and Lee. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, Mark.
It's been a pleasure. Bye.